make sure the person is qualified, make sure that they are getting the exact same experience that the other people in the same program are getting. Those two things alone, which are really not too difficult to do, can cover most of your bases.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, for another episode of the Corruption Files. Over the next two episodes, we're going to take a deep dive into, frankly, some delicious cases. They've got things that you really wouldn't expect, couldn't expect, and would never expect, and Hollywood couldn't write screenplays about them because, of course, movies have to be based in reality unless they're fantasy, unless they're FCPA violations. But today, we're going to take up financial services and sons and daughters, or as I like to say, princes and princelessings. So, for that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome back, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm looking forward to discussing the sons and daughters cases and others as we move forward.
So we've got three sons and daughters cases that we're going to focus on, although we can now expand that to nephews and close friends, because it really all started with Bank of New York Mellon back in April of 2015, when they hired nephews and a close friend of a official of a national investment company, the Libyan National Investment Company. And the fine was relatively small, but it answered the question of whether an hiring a close family member or a close friend could be an FCPA violation with a lot of other factors, and we found that that it could. The fine was relatively small compared to some of the other fines we're going to see. It was only $14.8 million. But as I indicated, it answered that question once and for all. And what we saw was three people hired who did not meet the basic hiring requirements of New York Mellon's graduate summer intern program. First of all, they weren't graduate students, which gives you a hint that perhaps something is amiss. There were no interviews. They didn't meet the academic criteria. But it went beyond that because as most summer internships are indicated by the term summer, it's a summer program. Well, they were given 6 month internships, and they were paid more than the regular summer interns. Their visa applications to come to the United States were paid for by BNY. And to top it all off, what little work they did do was on their uncle's account. So we had basically all of the negative or bad factors in place with this one. It was an early one, and once again, a lower fine than we see. But maybe I could pitch it over to you, Mike. What did you see in this BNY Mellon enforcement action that caught your attention? And then how did you try to counsel clients with the first one of these going forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think a good description of the key parts to this case. This was the first of I think 3 or 4 ultimately sons and daughters cases that involved financial services firms. Their first one to resolve. I actually think if we take a close look, probably J.P. Morgan, the investigation started there. And certainly the conduct appears to have started there earlier, at least, than it did it at Bank of New York Mellon. But this is such a tricky area. Hiring people because of their connections is as old as business, right? It happens around the world in every industry. It is no surprise that people with the right connections get more opportunities. And whatever you think about that from a sort of moral perspective or fairness perspective, it's the reality, and it's not necessarily a violation of the law. But you touched on all of the things that made this a really pretty clear violation of the FCPA, right? It wasn't just that Bank of New York Mellon was hiring relatives of an important client. It was that they weren't necessarily qualified, that the position wasn't exactly the same as it was for other people. They were clearly giving very special benefits to this narrow category of employees, narrow category of candidates. And the only really justification for that was, well, we hope to curry favor with their parents or uncles or whoever it is at the close connection. So that's where it became a clear violation. prior to 2015, we and other people in the space had been cautioning clients, you have to look at your hiring. It was no secret that hiring could be a thing of value and potentially lead to a violation of the FCPA. This became, along with its companion cases, really a shining example of that, kind of an easy one to hold up, to show people that, not only is hiring a risk area, but even these, summer internships are. Now, obviously, it's going to depend on the risk and the industry and what those summer internships turn out to be, or the value they have. But this was sort of that, key case that has been now put up over and over again for clients as we're discussing this risk area.
I remember in the summer of 2015, I was at what used to be the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal Anti-Corruption Summit, which was held in Washington. And there was actually a J.P. Morgan lawyer there. And it was after this, around the time this enforcement action came out. And his statement was, if they don't meet your hiring criteria, end of story, stop. Do not go forward. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Little did I know what J.P. Morgan was in for down the road. But that always struck me as, if they don't meet your hiring criteria, you can't hire them, because then you have hired them for some other reason. And certainly agree with everything you can. And what I want people to understand out of this podcast is you can hire sons and daughters. It is a risk, but it is a risk. It may be a high risk, but you can manage that risk if you follow some basic guidelines that I hope we can tease out of these three cases. But the Mellon case certainly portended or foreshadowed the next case, which really was the big one. And that was J.P. Morgan in November of 2016 with a fine of $268 million, hiring over 200 interns hired that had foreign government official or instrumentality officials connections. This case moved into the realm of, I'm not quite sure what, if absurd is the word, for two reasons. One was J.P. Morgan profited from hiring these interns to the tune of $100 million. How do we know that? Because they kept a spreadsheet. And anyone who's ever heard me talk knows that the three most important things in any compliance program are the following: document, document, document. But as a free practice point, if you're engaging in proper corruption, do not keep it in a spreadsheet, which J.P. Morgan did. They had a formal name for this hiring program called Sons and Daughters. It was just really beyond belief. They had compliance objecting to this program being overridden by the business units. And I want to just go through some of the stated reasons that some of these interns were hired. And we have this from the documented spreadsheet. Maintain good relationships with client. Quid pro quo for business. Promised IPO work. Father would go the extra mile to help J.P. Morgan. And the hire would significantly influence the role of J.P. Morgan in Asia Pacific. Once again, these came from the spreadsheet itself. And so Morgan recognized it was a clear quid pro quo. This stunned a lot of people that they would, one, really throw compliance to the side of the road, two, that they would document all this, and three, they were very open internally about the reasons that they were having these people hired going forward. And then there was one other reason given, and I'm not quite sure how this works into the calculus, Mike, but it was that once they go through the Morgan hiring program, the internship program, and they go back to work in their home countries, they'll be more likely to use J.P. Morgan. I'm not sure if that's a benefit or not, but it was certainly noted as one of the reasons. Then the other interesting thing was J.P. Morgan was represented by Mark Mendelson. Mark Mendelson really led the modern era of FCPA enforcement when he led the FCPA unit, I think from 03 or 04 into 09 in 2010. He is credited with really developing the modern enforcement investigative techniques used by the FCPA unit and led to an explosion of growth, some of which we talked about in prior podcasts. But he represented Morgan. And there was, Morgan got an NPA out of this. And I think it was more than rumors because it was reported in the press, but that's a memo that Mendelsohn wrote to try to keep Morgan from getting a DPA, which he was successful. That memo has never been made public, so we don't know what he said in there. But for those who criticize the revolving door, this may be close to example A or 1A. Nevertheless, as a lawyer, I can only say he did a great job for his client. And from the legal profession perspective, very proud of the work he did on this case in the face of some really bad facts. So I've tried to tee it up. What did you see in Morgan, and what intrigued you so much?
Yeah, again, you've touched the key points. One of the things that's super interesting about the fact pattern here is it seems like this program went on for 7 years, I think, at Morgan, and was really embraced, juiced in Asia Pacific. So in JP Morgan Asia Pacific, and it moved from where it started as, oh, hey, one of our clients' sons is looking for an internship. We should hire him. Let's give him a little extra, give him or her a little extra look or attention, or maybe move them up to the top of the pile, to what it became, which was basically, to be considered for these lucrative positions. They were tracking to see what kind of benefit could you give us with your connections, right? And as you said, they had the spreadsheet that really laid it out very, very nicely for prosecutors in terms of the expected value, and then ultimately the actual value, so they could track their return on investment. It was really, really incredible. I always it doesn't happen as much as it used to. It doesn't seem, but there was a time period where I felt like 1 out of every 3 FCPA resolution involved Excel files, was just tracking all the bribe payments. It was really, really incredible. They were being very organized about their corruption for a short period of time there. I think. When we had Mellon in 2015, and then, that got people thinking. Then you fast forward about a year, a little over a year, and Morgan drops, and it's compared to what Mellon was, which was, SEC cease and desist order, small fine, as you mentioned, about $14 million, including, some disgorgement. Morgan, $268 million, big number, like you said, an NPA, but, really a big number with that sort of gives off the seriousness of it. So initially, when we saw that, you start to try to think, all right, what's the difference? Why is Mellon sitting there at 14 million? Only the SEC is involved, and Morgan is much bigger and looks like it's much more serious. And I think as you start to look at it and realize that they, as you mentioned, profited $100 million that could be traced to this hiring program. The fact that it went for 7 years, I think Mellon was just 2 years. At least that's what they have in the SEC order. And just this last element of, this isn't just doing favors for clients in the hopes that they're going to do something back. It was a very structured program with the intention of creating favor. And then you have the other things, that overriding compliance professionals, showing that the compliance controls in place really are not sufficient, and that can lead to bigger numbers and bigger settlements. It was a pretty widely known fact that the Mellon case was not the end of these sons and daughters cases. So we were all kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I think we had known that Morgan was under investigation for this conduct. But I will say, when the number first appeared in November 2016, it was very surprising.
The next case, Mike, was Credit Suisse. And we could probably devote an entire podcast series to Credit Suisse and some of their nefarious actions. But here, we're going to limit it to their sons and daughters FCPA violation. This occurred or came down in July of 2018. The fine was $77 million. And the additional factors in this case that came out were not only did they track the hiring, but they actually put a calculation in place in their spreadsheet, which they documented, of the percentage profit for each hire. And in this case, we saw some specific details about why the hire didn't meet the criteria of Credit Suisse. So referral hire number one was described as, quote, a princess who was not used to too many rounds of interviews. End quote. Referral hire number two had his family had to intercede directly to him to get him hired, and then he interceded directly with his family members to close business on behalf of Credit Suisse, and he actually received a bonus from this. Referral hire number three was the daughter of a high-ranking government official, and it was noted, quote, her prospective boss had doubts about her ability beyond getting a meeting set up and completing a PowerPoint slide for a pitch book. Referral hire number four was quoted as wanting to be promoted as soon as he got there, and the promotion request was deemed to be abnormal. So these are the kinds of facts that Credit Suisse had reported in the settlement agreement, and it demonstrates how it was really outside the norm. The fine and penalty was relatively small compared to the JP Morgan fine, but the spreadsheet they put together really took the financial analysis of how these people were used, not simply hiring and did we get the deal, but hiring, how did they intercede with their family members to help us, and then did we pay them a bonus for interceding with their family to help us after we hired them when we shouldn't have. So maybe to conclude this podcast with our cases, what about this case you found either interesting, fascinating, or unique from the other two?
Yeah, I guess to your point about the way that they were tracking the payments, we probably shouldn't be surprised that these bankers were really carefully tracking the return on their investment and the various monetary inputs. But it is really pretty remarkable when you see the spreadsheets and think about kind of how they were really being super data focused in how they were paying, essentially bribing these officials. To me, coming off of Morgan and Mellon, sort of slotted in right in the middle, and I don't mean that just because it was the in the middle in terms of the ultimate penalty paid, but in terms of the conduct, when you're looking at the three cases and you're comparing them in terms of the length of the conduct, what they earned, the benefit they earned off of it, and how they were tracking it, Credit Suisse sort of fell right in the middle for me, and that was, it was a sophisticated scheme for sure. I think if I'm not mistaken, Credit Suisse Hong Kong, similar to Morgan, got an NPA rather than a DPA. So in that sense, when we were looking at these things, trying to learn lessons and figure out what prosecutors were thinking, that was one thing that we noted, right? Was that this is another NPA case. But really it's going back to our initial point about Mellon. For all of these cases, we were in a situation where there was a way for these banks to hire relatives of important clients that would not have violated the FCPA. And I think there's a lot of middle ground between what they did and what would be perfectly acceptable. But there's so many examples in these cases that show that it was a clear quid pro quo, right? There was clear intent, and it's not just documentation, but the way that their programs were run, the fact that these people were by and large not qualified. I mean, you have documentation documenting how poorly they interviewed and all of these pieces. So when we have counseled clients on this issue, we use these cases as examples, but it's really, they're far on one end of the spectrum from what most clients are dealing with. And I think that, to me, the most important takeaway from these cases and for companies that have internship programs that are valuable, that, maybe you get requests from clients to hire relatives. You've already mentioned it, Tom. The number one thing before you do anything else is this person qualified for the job, independent of who their family members are. Are they qualified? And then you can move into other controls. But for some companies, this is going to be a high risk area. To me, it's actually an area, high risk or low risk, that is relatively easy to control. Right? Make sure the person is qualified. Make sure that they are getting the exact same experience that the other people in the same program are getting. And if you do those two things, you're gonna cover yourself 99%. Right? There's the additional 1% of diligence that needs to be done, but those two things alone, which are really not too difficult to do, can cover most of your bases.
So I absolutely agree with that, Mike. I would add a couple of other questions that you might want to ask at the start of the process. In addition to, number one, does the candidate meet your firm's hiring criteria? Number two, did the foreign official whose family member you are considering for demand or even suggest your company hire the candidate? And number three, has the foreign official made or will make a decision that will benefit your company? The answer to the first question is no, meaning they don't meet the hiring criteria. It should be the end of your inquiry. If the second two inquiries are yes, you move to a higher level, I think, of potential FCPA risk. But I would emphasize the point you ended with. This is a risk that can be managed. If they do meet your hiring criteria, if they are treated the same as other interns, if they do not work on their family member's account, I think you can structure a way to have a beneficial internship program in relationship with the candidate that does not violate the FCPA. Once again, all of these need to be documented. And the final point is, I want to emphasize for compliance professionals, everything Mike and I have talked about here at the end is an internal control. And so if the government comes knocking, you can say, yes, we have an internal control around this specific issue. And if you have laid these controls out in a policy and in procedure, you've got an internal control that you can show them. Hopefully you've documented your decisions at each step with a documented package that I think will satisfy a regulator if you haven't violated your own internal controls. So you have persuaded me that this is certainly a risk that can be managed. I think it can be a higher risk, but it can be managed, and it can be something that can be beneficial for you going forward.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay, Mike. Well, this one was a ton of fun, but we're going to have a lot of fun in our next episode where we look at 4 telecom cases. I can't wait.
Looking forward to it, Tom.